Hi, everyone. I'm Catherine Versillo. I'm a writer and artist researching the complicated relationship between health and creativity. This is the Create Me Free podcast, where I go through a variety of different ways of looking at that with you. If you are just now joining me, this is episode 5, and we have been looking at creative process. So we've been looking at how health, by which I mean holistic health, so physical health, mental health, financial health, systemic, relational health, all the ways that well-being and circumstance impact creative process, meaning the ways in which we work. And in previous episodes, we kind of looked at, well, what does creative process mean? And I worked through some of the pages in my creative health cartography workbook, the first section of which is on creative process. So today I realize that I've been talking a lot about this. I've given you insights into my creative process and how health has impacted me a bit, but I haven't really talked about the actual how of how health is impacting creative process. So it can impact it in a lot of different ways. In the Creative Health Cartography workbook, we did go over, there are a couple lists in there about signs of a block in this area. So an example is if you can't start, if the blank page or empty canvas feels like a wall, a barrier that's interrupting the way that you work, it is possible your health is impacting you in this area. An example of specific health things that are mentioned on this list. ADHD symptoms can make the organizational aspects of your creative work harder. So planning, sequencing, and maintaining your materials, this affects your process. This isn't always true. I want to be really clear about that. Everyone experiences things differently. Everyone creates differently. Everyone adapts differently. So this is just an example. Mood swings. So if you have mood swings related to hormonal changes, to such bipolar conditions, various reasons for mood swings, they can change your creative capacity, which changes how you create. And then one more example is the side effects of medications. So some of the medications that we take for all kinds of different conditions can cause brain fog, fatigue, and this interferes with the mental demands that your creative work might ask of you, and therefore can interrupt the way that you create. It can change it. It can alter it. So it's not necessarily a bad, horrible thing. It's just this could be what's going on, and how do you work with that? So in the next part of the workbook, the next list on that is adaptations that people who I've worked with over time or who I've researched or interviewed have told me that they've adapted to these blocks. So they see the block in the process, and some of the adaptations include one of the ones I talked about previously was developing multiple entry points into the same project. So you realize that for whatever reason, your process is interrupted by mood or energy or something like that, and you develop multiple entry points so that when that happens, you might find a different way in. That's just one example. So that's kind of the background. So what we're going to do today is, instead of working through the workbook today, I really just wanted to do more of a chat with you or for you about more specifically about all the different ways that creative process can be interrupted by health. And the way I'm thinking I'm going to do that is I study a lot of art history and a lot of artist biographies, and I am going to go through 13 different artists whose health impacted their creative process, as reported in biographies or in their own diaries. And those 13 artists I'm going to use to demonstrate or exemplify 6 mechanisms where health alters the act of making at the level of the process. So um, um, let's see. So let me see. Let me go over the 6 things, and then I'll tell you about the artists, and we'll dig more into it. So mechanism 1 is sensory recalibration. So this is when one of your primary senses is used in the creating of your work, and it's either altered or lost in some way. And you still create work, but you create work differently. So recalibrating your senses in order to create. The next one, number 2, is physical reinvention. So similar to sensory, except that for physical, it's what you can or can no longer do with your physical body and how that interrupts your creative process. And then we're going to look at mechanism 3, which is the symptom itself as a starting point. So I'm calling it like the condition as a direct source, by which I mean that um, the actual starting point of the thing being made it's not metaphorically creating the work, it's directly creating the work. I'll get more into that. It'll make more sense hopefully as I go into the examples. That's number 3. Number 4 is temporal restructuring. So this is the rhythms of a creative life, the duration of sessions of time that you can work, the time in between sessions that you might need to rest before creating again. Temporal shaping of your creative process can be affected by your health in a variety of different ways. Mechanism 5, urgency in the compressed timeline. So this is really when you're looking at possible end of life, realizing that you're not going to necessarily have as much time to create as you thought you did. This can change how you approach your creative process. And collaborative necessity. We don't create in isolation. A lot of the research into, and first of all, there's not a ton of research into specifically how health impacts creativity. There's different aspects of it. There's not really an in-depth, cohesive area of study in this way, but what does exist is generally about the individual. And I'm also interested in when we're making in community. I'm interested in the community level when community health impacts our creativity, but then also just in making in community what that does and doesn't shift for us. So those are the 6 mechanisms. Working with others, collaborative necessity. Second was urgency in the compressed timeline. Then we were talking about temporal restructuring. Then we were talking about the condition as direct source. And then the physical reinvention, and then the sensory reinvention. Those were the 6 things. And we're going to talk about 13 different artists across those. So let's go back to mechanism 1, sensory recalibration. So this is what happens when a primary sense used in the making of a particular kind of work is altered or lost. Again, the loss doesn't end the process, it displaces the process. So sensory is about input. It's our sight, what we're taking in through sight, what we're taking in through hearing, what we're taking in through our arguably 5 senses. This incoming information still comes in, but it has to come in through a different channel. And so, for example, it's fairly well known that when people lose their sight over time, some of their other senses get more heightened. You can practice this yourself with little exercises of eliminating or reducing some of your senses and tuning into others and heightening them. So your sense of hearing, for example, could become much more acute, and you actually experience the world differently as a result of that. So then what you make and how you make ends up being rebuilt around this new intake of information. So the new sensory experience that you have. So I'm going to talk about 3 different artists here: Evelyn Glennie, Francisco Goya, and Georgia O'Keeffe. So Evelyn Glennie was born in 1965 in Aberdeenshire, Scotland. And she began losing her hearing at a very young age. She was about 8 years old when progressive nerve deterioration caused her to start losing her hearing. And by the time she was 12, she was profoundly deaf. So she wanted to go to the Royal Academy of Music, and during her audition, they told her that accepting a deaf student into the percussion program would not be appropriate because theoretically she couldn't hear. It's probably obvious to most of us that, you can still feel drumming, for example, still feel percussion. It's a different sense, but at that time, in the 60s, they were telling her that. However, spoiler alert, she was accepted into the Royal Academy of Music, and she graduated with the highest honors of her year, of her class. So what Glennie developed and what she has spoken and written about at length is a way of hearing music through the body rather than through the ear. So she performs barefoot and then the vibrations from the stage floor travel directly into her feet and legs. And she has described feeling the bass frequencies in her legs and lower body, whereas the mid-range frequencies of sound she feels in her chest. And then the higher frequencies are literally experienced higher in her body. She feels them in her face, neck, and arms. So she doesn't experience sound as absent. She experiences it as distributed across the surface of her body rather than concentrated in the two small structures, ears, on either side of the head. So she hears differently than we are usually used to when we're talking about hearing. Um, my partner's a drummer, and he has mentioned an experience he had drumming for someone who was deaf, and that was a pretty profound experience. So it it's just a different way of hearing, but because it's different, all of the traditional ways of taking in that music had to be adapted. So Glennie, there's a widely seen talk on what she calls listening. And the core argument of this talk is that hearing and listening are different things, which I think can be said in other ways, in other, not industries, in other fields as well. In psychology, hearing and listening are different things. I might hear what my partner is saying, but am I really listening to it, right? In her talk, she says the ear is one pathway into sound, the body is another pathway into sound. And most hearing people have allowed their ear to become their only pathway because they didn't have any reason not to. They didn't have any reason to try to hear with the body. Glennie's process developed because she had to hear in a different way. So the process that she uses to prepare for and perform a piece of music is built entirely around this sensory relationship that's distributed throughout her body. So her sensory relationship to sound shapes how she actually makes her music, shapes the process of that. Now she did lose her hearing at a very young age, but she wasn't born deaf, so she had some sense of that original hearing world. And though her creative growth came at her later ages, it was fundamentally shaped by the ability to hear through her entire body in this way. She does not make music despite her deafness. It's not a making up for, it's not a lack. She makes music through the perceptual system that her deafness required her to build. It's a more somatic, a more physically attentive, a more body integrated system than many hearing percussionists use. And then arguably maybe percussionists, because they're feeling it in some ways, may be more body attuned than some other kinds of musicians. But in this case, it's like the deafness produced the methodology of what she was creating. The process she uses to create, how she creates, is critically shaped by how she hears, the senses she uses. So that's example one of the sensory recalibration. Example two, Francisco Goya. He was born in Spain in the 18th century, and at the time he was a court painter to the Spanish royal family. He was professionally successful and socially embedded in this when he became severely ill in 1792. This illness, which historians have never definitively identified exactly what caused it, left him profoundly deaf at age 46. The deafness arrived suddenly and stayed permanently. So he was much older than Glennie and had a completely different experience. Also, he was not a musician. He was a portrait artist. He was a visual artist. So what does sound have to do with that? It's really just a way of taking in information. So he continued his court commissions for years, and the portraits and tapestry cartoons that he was doing continued to look a lot like they did before he went deaf. But there was a shift in him. Something was accumulating in him. And a lot of other things were going on at this time, too. It wasn't just the deafness. He witnessed the French invasion of Spain in 1808, and there were 6 years of war that informed his artwork. So the Disasters of War etchings are specifically about this. It's a set of 82 prints documenting the execution and mutilation of civilians, and it came from this period. But it came in part from a unique experience for him of watching this war happen in silence. So he wasn't taking news in through the medium of hearing, right? He wasn't talking to people in the same way about this. He was taking it in silence, and this created a visual output of the disasters of war. Um, After the war, he moved to a country house outside Madrid, and the house had the name Quinta del Sordo, which actually means the village of the deaf. I had already had that name before he moved there. And from 1820 to 1823, he covered the interior walls of this place, directly painting on the plaster of the walls. There's a total of 14 paintings that were painted on the walls, and we know them now as the black paintings. These are dark paintings. Um, they are of Saturn devouring his son, figures dissolving into the darkness, a dog's head barely above a ground line. There's some dark material there. And he didn't tell anyone about what he was creating. He didn't exhibit them. No one paid him for this. He really, as far as we know, didn't ever intend anyone to see them except for himself. It was a thing he was expressing um, from where he was at, both with the deafness and with the trauma of the war. They're completely different from everything else he ever had painted before, even from the disasters of war work that he did. So they are arguably inseparable from the conditions of the making. So the process is inseparable from the conditions he was making in. So he was working alone. He was obviously in silence. He couldn't hear in the same way as before. He did not have any surfaces that he planned to show on. And he didn't really have a way to process what he had seen with the war and everything else through the official language of court portraiture that he'd been working in before. The deafness enforced solitude, compounded by this trauma, created this unique set of working conditions, and is from those conditions that the black paintings emerged, and that work now defines a lot of his legacy. So that's a lot of the areas of what I study overlap. So I have looked at how health and circumstance impact creativity in 6 broad categories: creative process, medium, content, productivity, identity, and business or sustainability. And we're talking about process now, which is how we work, but also this could arguably be how his health, his experience, his circumstance impacted the content of what he created. And it could arguably be the medium as well. It's not quite as easily delineated, but I put it in process because he changed how he was working. He was no longer working under commission. He was no longer. It's I'm probably still working to fully define this one. As I'm doing this podcast, it's my research in action. So I've studied his work and learned about him, but I'm still kind of thinking this through and looking at. I thought it was interesting that the deafness impacted his creativity, even though his creativity wasn't rooted in music or sound like Glennie's was. I thought that was interesting. So, and then the third artist I'm going to talk about in regard to the senses, Georgia O'Keeffe. So Georgia O'Keeffe was born in the late 19th century in Wisconsin. In 1949, she moved to New Mexico. There's a whole complicated history there of her life with her husband, Alfred Stieglitz. I've written actually a lot about this on the Create Me Free Substack. Her work is really interesting to me, but I'm going to fast forward to she moved to New Mexico and she spent the last years of her life, many, many years of her long life in the high desert in New Mexico. She painted the bones and the flowers and the sky and the red hills there. This is something she's really famous for. She's famous for her flowers and she's famous for those bone skull paintings. Very, very visual artist. Well, around 1971, she began to experience macular degeneration, which began to affect her central vision. And she was 84, so it was age-related loss of eyesight. But within about a year of realizing it was happening, she had lost most of her central vision. And she stopped painting. And she was really interesting because she was not very sentimental about it. She just said in interviews at the time that she couldn't see the fine detail that painting required, so she stopped doing it. But she didn't stop creating. So I don't know how I didn't know about her later work. I've known her work for a long time and knew about her paintings, but I really didn't know that in the end of her life, what she was doing mostly was working in clay. So clay didn't require the precision of the sense of sight. It was something she could do with her hands, right? So a young potter named Juan Hamilton came to work for her as an assistant, and he introduced her to pottery, and she began making clay pots and forms. Eventually, she actually did return to painting. He helped her by setting up the canvases for her, mixing the colors. So he did kind of the prep work that her sight had taken away from her. And then she began working at a much larger scale than she used to because she could still see, just not like before. She had lost her central vision, so she still had some peripheral vision. She couldn't see the details, but one of the things she said was, I can see enough to put a little paint on the edge of things. And I enjoy doing that very much. She was 98 years old when she passed away. She was still making things. She was painting and she was doing clay work and she was creating. And so we can kind of see the sensory recalibration for her was at first feeling like I can't see, so I can't do the painting that I was doing before. I cannot create in the same way. I'm going to change my in that case, she changed her medium, right? She didn't change her process. She changed her medium. So I can't paint. I'm going to use clay. However, she then ended up getting back into painting, and that was a change in the process. Um, she couldn't engage with the work in that fine detail. She couldn't look at it the same. She couldn't paint it the same. She had to have someone else set up the colors for her, which was not part of the process previously. And then she liked to paint around the edges, as she said, which was not part of her process before. So those are three examples, and those are three like big, obvious examples. There's a lot of examples of eyesight, loss of eyesight changing people's um, pe- famous people's creative work. Yeah, I can think of a whole bunch. There's an argument that many of the Impressionists painted the way they did in large part because they were losing their eyesight and didn't see clearly, so they painted in impressions. There are some specific ones, but that's kind of a broad one. Um, but that's just one example. It's a starting point for how does health impact creativity. One of the ways is when our senses change, the way we create often changes to adapt to that change in senses. So then moving from the senses into more physical. So sensory recalibration is really about the input to the senses, but physical reinvention is about the output. So what happens when the part of the body that directly executes the creative work changes? So if your hands change, your posture changes, your physical stamina changes, you can't hold the medium the same way, you can't move the body the same way. When the ability to execute in the same way changes because your body changes, then often you have to develop a new process. I am going to talk about three artists in this category as well: Frida Kahlo, Django Reinhardt, and Dorothea Lange. And Frida Kahlo is the most obvious one that everyone knows. She was in a bus accident. She had a lot of horrible physical things happen. She spent a lot of time in pain and a lot of that time in bedridden, and she painted from her bed. And there was unique easel contraption that was painted or that was established so that she could create from bed. Her process, her actual physical process of creating, comes from that. So, but let me go back a little bit. She was born in 1907, and in 1925, so she was 18 years old. That was when she was riding the bus home from school. And she was hit by a trolley car. Or the bus was hit by a trolley car, and she sustained fractures to her spinal column, her collarbone, her ribs. Her right leg was fractured. Her right foot was dislocated. A steel handrail impaled her hip, emerged through her pelvis. It was very, very, very serious, and they actually didn't think she was going to survive, but she did survive. However, she spent months and months in bed in a plaster corset. She could not move, and that was when the special easel was made so that she could paint while lying in her bed. And there was also a mirror that was installed so that she could look at her own reflection and paint, which, if you know her work, she's done a lot of self-portraiture. And part of that process is, arguably due to the trauma and the wanting to look at herself anew, see herself in a different way. But part of that was literally just the process of physically creating. So she did not decide to make self-portraits as some sort of narcissism. She made them because that was the subject that was available to her. So in this case, health impacted content, what she should create, or what she was creating, and then also process how she was creating it. She arguably, one of the quotes she said is, "I paint myself because I am so often alone and because I am the subject I know best. Conditions create the art." The horizontal position, the mirror, the limited reach of her arms, these were the conditions she was working with, and the process that developed inside of those conditions produced work that, amazing, amazing work, both in terms of the skill that she had and also the content, the unique creativity of what she was creating. So throughout her lifetime, it wasn't like she just was in pain for that little bit of time and then was never in bed again. She actually had to undergo more than 30 surgeries throughout her lifetime, and she had recovery, she had operations, she had a whole lot of other stuff going on. And she created work that reflected the embodied suffering she was going through. So there again is the content. It's kind of hard to separate, but she did it the way she did it based on the constraints of her body at the time. Django Reinhardt was born in 1910 in Belgium. He was a working guitarist at age 18, and then in November 1928, so he's still 18, a fire started in the caravan where he and his wife were living. And he was really badly burned. So he had been a working guitarist. This fire happened, and he was badly burned. His on his left hand, his ring and little fingers were so severely damaged that they fused into a curled position and could not be straightened. So that hand is what he would have used for fretting when playing guitar, and he couldn't use them in the conventional way. The guitar and the technique that existed at that time requires 4 fingers on the fretting hand to reach full harmonic range. He had 2, the other 2 curled up. So he spent his recovery period rebuilding his relationship to the instrument from the ground up. He invented a technique in which the index and middle fingers carried all the melodic work, often at speeds that 4-finger technique produces through entirely different mechanics. So he achieved the same speeds, but he had to use a completely different process to get there because physically his hands couldn't do it the way that he had been trained and taught. And then he used his fused fingers in a way too. He didn't just not use them. He came up with specific unique chord shapes that the injury had made accidentally available. So a hand that had not been damaged would probably never have figured that out, though that angle or that way, because there was no reason to. His hand figured it out, changed the process. So what he built from that technique is what we now call gypsy jazz, or jazz manouche. The style is characterized by a particular rhythmic drive, a facility for extremely fast single note runs in the treble register, and harmonic voicings that are distinctive to the 2-finger approach. Musicians who study Reinhardt are studying a technique that exists because of a specific injury to a specific hand. The technique cannot be fully replicated by an undamaged hand because the injury was structural to what the technique is. The style is the reinvention. The reinvention is the art. I think that's an interesting way of phrasing it. And then the third one from this physical category, Dorothea Lange. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. She was born in late 19th century in New Jersey. And at the age of 7, she contracted polio, unfortunately very common at that time. So her right leg was significantly weaker and thinner than her left, which gave her a characteristic limp that stayed with her throughout her life. She became one of the most important documentary photographers of the 20th century, known particularly for her work with the Farm Security Administration during the Great Depression. In an interview late in her life, she spoke directly about her polio diagnosis or condition, and here's what she said. "It was the most important thing that happened to me. It formed me, guided me, instructed me, helped me, and humiliated me all at once. I've never gotten over it, and I am aware of the way I walk." This awareness isn't metaphorical. She moved differently through the world, and people stared at her. Sometimes she moved more slowly, but in that, by moving more slowly, she had a different relationship to the spaces she was in than she would have had otherwise. She was more attentive to the terrain that she was working around, and because of that, she had a different photographic approach than she might have had she never had the polio. Now she got it at a young age, and we don't know for sure, but she is the one saying that this was true for her. That the different physical relationships she had with the space gave her a different photographic approach. She was less threatening to approach than, for example, a healthy man. So if a healthy man was striding through a migrant camp with a camera, they might not have been able to take the same pictures as her because she felt that she moved at a pace that gave her subjects more time to adjust to her presence. She spent time in physical proximity to people in ways that required them to accept her body alongside their own before she lifted the camera. Here, an example, if you look at the image Migrant Mother, it's not an accident of framing. It is the result of a specific physical and relational approach to a subject that was shaped by the body that she was in. So the approach she took to her photography, the creative process, the process of going and slowly entering a space and non-threateningly photographing people who might be vulnerable or not wanting to be photographed. That process was shaped by the experience of the body she was in, her physical body. Physical reinvention in all three of these cases is not a story about persistence. It is a story about what happens when the old mode of execution or the expected mode of execution is no longer available and the maker is still present with something to make. So I don't want to glorify, oh, you got injured and then like, I don't want to celebrate. That's not that I don't want to celebrate. It's that I don't want to make that the story. The point, it's not about triumphing. It's about these things happen. Health impacts creativity in many different ways. And it changes things. And it's just looking at how it changes and how we adapt. And so it's not saying, oh, thankfully I have this body. This is the body I have, for better or worse, like it or not, celebrate it or don't celebrate it, whatever feeling you have about your own body, but that this is what I can then create with it. So that is mechanism 2. So mechanism 3, I'm hoping I can explain this better now. So the condition is direct source. An artist makes work. Okay, so it's not about them making work about their condition. That's content. It's more literal. The symptom of the condition is the actual starting material of the creative session. It is the input. It is the thing being processed in the making. So I'm going to give you the examples of 2 people here, Martin Ramirez and Yayoi Kusama. So I'm going to start with Kusama, who was born in 1929 in Japan, and she started experiencing neurological hallucinations at a very young age. So hallucinations such as flowers were speaking to her. She would see patterns of dots. She would see nets spreading across the surfaces of everything. She would look at her hands and she would see hallucinations of dots and nets there. We know this because there's a lot of interviews with her autobiography where she has talked about this. She has continued, that's something she's had her whole life, these hallucinations. So she began painting hallucinations even when she was young. She painted what she saw. And she's very famous for the dots. If you know her work at all, you know the dots. The dots and the nets that appear on every surface, particularly in her infinity net canvases, are also fill infinity mirror rooms. So these are rooms where we get a little more of the perceptual experience of what she experiences in the hallucinations. I think what I'm trying to say here is that she experiences the hallucination. The hallucination is the symptom. And she actually creates, that's the starting point of what she creates. So it's not that she is creating the hallucination as content, although she is. It's almost like she's taking the hallucination and she's making these dots and she's putting it into paint or fabric or whatever material she's using. She's described this as basically making it present, making it visible in order to neutralize the power of it. So she has this hallucination, and she's described the making as a way to surround the hallucination with itself until the fear of the hallucination reduces. Since 1977, she has lived by her own choice in a psychiatric facility. Every day she walks from her facility to her art studio and she works and she walks back. And um, it's a very interesting setup and process. And she is still creating art today. She's in her 90s and her work was recently here at SF MoMA. She's traveled around the world plenty. Um, so in some ways it's content. Her hallucinations have created the content, but they've also been part of the process, in terms of the starting point, the repetition. It's kind of like an OCD compulsion of these dots, 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 related to anxiety. She's known for having anxiety. Um, it's the symptom is the compulsion, and the compulsion starts the process of how she does the work. Martine Ramirez, born in 1895 in Mexico, immigrated to the United States in 1925 and was working in the railroad and mining industries and sending money home to his family. Around 1930, he stopped speaking. He became increasingly withdrawn and began wandering around. He was institutionalized and eventually was placed at DeWitt State Hospital in Auburn, California, where he would live for the rest of his life. His diagnosis was dementia praecox, which is what we now call schizophrenia. With people, with a lot of people, these diagnoses are posthumous, or there's a debate about whether or not that's the right diagnosis, but it gives you a sense of what symptoms he might have had. So he began making drawings from whatever materials were available at the hospital. So bags of brown paper, scraps of mail, toilet paper, breadcrumbs, saliva, the sheets that they had there, shoe polish. The drawings themselves depict tunnels, arcades, mazes, landscapes that recede into impossible depth. They also depict some physical objects, trains, deer, Madonna figures, deer and other animals as well. So a psychiatrist at the hospital began collecting these drawings, and the 1960s, the work was discovered. Discovered is questionable. There's a whole lot to be said about outsider art and discovering artists and whatnot. But in any case, what matters for what we're talking about right now, is that the relationship between his interior world and the making is this mechanism that I'm talking about. He did not have language. He did not speak. He had not spoken in decades. The drawings were the expression. What the drawings express is not translatable into any other form because the form itself is the expression. The tunnel that goes in and never quite resolves, the arcade of arches repeating, the horizon receding. It's not that he was making work about his condition, schizophrenia or whatever it might have been. It's that the condition itself was the channel through which he arrived at the work. The drawing was the communication that was available to him, and he used the visual logic of an interior world to create this artwork. So the idea here that I'm trying to convey is the condition isn't the theme. It's not like I chose to write about or paint about my topic. It's that it's the immediate input that causes the work to begin and dictates at least some of the process. That's one of the mechanisms. It's probably the hardest of the six to capture. So I'm going to go to one that's a little bit easier, which is temporal restructuring. So how does health that changes our experience of how time, meaning duration or rhythm of time in our lives, health can impact creativity through this temporal lens. So, the duration of a session, the time between sessions, the distribution of productive periods across a career. So it's kind of looking at the big picture of time as well as the little immediate picture of time and how time is navigated and how that changes the creative process. So 2 artists to talk about here to illustrate this, Virginia Woolf and Nina Simone. Virginia Woolf was born in 1882 in London. She navigated severe mental illness across her adult life with extended periods of depression, incapacitation, hospitalizations, and what is typically she's described as madness. And in madness, it was the inability to read, write, or think coherently, sometimes lasting months. So it has been said perhaps she was experiencing bipolar depression because she also had periods of intense sustained creative energy. So in those times, writing came really easily, fluently, speedily for long periods of time. So sometimes she couldn't read, write, think at all. And then that was because of her symptoms and her condition. And then sometimes she was very prolific. She tracked these states in her diary with remarkable precision, and it's one of the most detailed records we have of a writer documenting the relationship between her mental states and her creative process. It's an excellent example of trying to understand some of this stuff. So she described the high periods as flying, as electric, as the sense that everything was connected and available. She described the low periods as being under glass, in a fog, or as simply nothing. So her creative process was built around this rhythm. And it's not necessarily that she intended it to be that way or not. She just learned when to push and when to rest based on what her body needed and what she could actually have the capacity to do. She learned what kinds of work were possible in which states. So in periods of acute illness, when she did not have sustained time, when she couldn't work for long periods of time, she didn't write novels. She knew she couldn't. So she wrote letters, she wrote diaries, she wrote little reviews, short things. It's not that it's not necessarily that she was resigned. It was just, this is the capacity I have. So what can I do with that? The Waves, which novel of hers, it's considered her most experimental novel, was largely written during one of these opposite periods of creative energy that are intense and almost frightening with how much speed the thinking and writing are coming. Interesting. So interesting. All of her work was kind of shaped a little differently, even in those longer works. So in times when she really couldn't work because of symptoms, then she was writing letters. But she was also writing novels throughout her lifetime, and they all kind of had different energies to them. So The Waves, experimental, was really intense. Mrs. Dalloway, very well known, came at a period of relative stability. So she had a breakdown. She was coming out of it. She was basically stable, not too high, not too low. And Mrs. Dalloway came out of that. And The Lighthouse was written in fits and starts across a period of fluctuating health, but that was pretty well managed. So it wasn't too low or too high, but there was a lot of ups and downs in terms of how much time she could give in any given day or week or month. So it happened in fits and starts. And you can kind of see that the shape of each book is partly the shape of that mental state she was in. And she wasn't writing about the mental states. It's just structured that way because of the relationship she had to time and therefore the creative process. As you likely know, she died by suicide in March 1941. She put stones in her coat pocket and walked into the river. She left letters to her husband and her sister that are very clear, very lucid, that say she knows what she was doing. She had been through previous episodes of this, and she just didn't feel like she could do this again, and she chose not to try. And I'm bringing this up, this mention of dying by suicide, because I think it relates, at least to some extent, of the temporal structuring of her life. Her creative life was always in relationship to the possibility of this ending. She had these dark times. She knew that might come. And so she worked when she could work because she knew she wouldn't always be able to work. Always meaning sometimes she'd be sick, but also always meaning she wasn't going to be here forever. That was very present for her. So sometimes the urgency of needing of the work is visible, I think, in the writing itself. So that relationship of time for her. Nina Simone was the sixth of 8 children of a Methodist minister and his wife. She was born in North Carolina in 1933, and she was a child prodigy at the piano. However, she applied to the Curtis Institute of Music in Philadelphia, and despite being a prodigy, she was rejected. And there's a whole history there. It was likely due to racism. And racism affected a lot of her lifetime and career, of course. And she also was probably living with bipolar depression, which also was a constraint in her life or an effect in her life. Her performances were notorious for being unpredictable. So she might have a set that's supposed to happen and she might play for 2 hours beyond that. Alternatively, she might stop in the middle of a song, walk off the stage. She might berate an audience for not listening attentively enough or for the wrong reasons or for not understanding what she was doing, or she might love the audience that day. Her recordings from the 1960s and 1970s document a performer whose states were audible in the music. The ferocious precision of a night when something was working can be heard in the music, and the anguished, unwieldy quality of a night when things weren't working can be heard in the music. She left the United States in 1974. She could not sustain her career here. So she lived in a bunch of other places, and in that time, she often went long periods of time without performing at all. She wrote in her autobiography that she was ill and that the illness was related to everything: her performances, her relationships, her politics, her music. She was older when she was diagnosed with bipolar. She was in her 50s, and so it hadn't been treated, and she'd been maybe mislabeled or misdiagnosed. So the point being that the nature of her work changed, the content or the medium, not the medium, but the pacing, that urgency or that fallow periods, you can hear it in the work. But it's related to time. She had peaks and valleys, you could say, with the time she could create, and with relationship to her own creativity that was in control of being in control of her creativity versus feeling not in control of it. So the process, the shape of her creative life, the starting, the stopping, the sustaining, the sharing, all impacted by that, what was the ups and downs of the time temporal. I did talk a little about this with Virginia Woolf, the urgency of the compressed timeline. So this is a little different because arguably Woolf did not have a diagnosis that she was going to die. She wasn't creating out of urgency in that sense. But it's similar. So when a diagnosis collapses the future, the question of what to make next becomes the question of what to make at all. So I get a terminal diagnosis and my doctor says I'm going to die in 2 months. Whatever I make next is gotta be really the thing. I can't, dilly-dally and just make this and make that and hope I hit upon the thing. That's kind of what this is. So, there's a sentimental I don't want to glorify any of this. So this is an area that's been romanticized at time. The romantic version is, an artist is facing mortality, and so they're going to just produce their most transcendent, most beautiful work in the face of dying. Surely that has arguably happened, but that's not, I don't want to glorify it. It's more practical than that. It's okay, here's what's come up. How do I change what I make in the face of knowing I'm not going to be making much longer? So Charlotte Salomon was born in 1917 in Berlin, and her mother died by suicide when she was 9. Suicide was a thing in her family. Her uncle died by suicide. Her grandmother died by suicide. There were some other family members. So she studied painting at the Berlin Academy, but then was forced out of that from racism, from being Jewish. The Nuremberg laws forced her out. She fled to the south of France in 1939 to live with her maternal grandparents, and then she was hiding from the Nazis. And while hiding from the Nazis, knowing that what was happening in Germany was coming towards her, she created a work she titled Leben oder Theater. Oh, it's Life or Theater. Sorry, I was trying to pronounce the German and I wasn't getting there. Life or Theater. It consists of 1325 small sheets of paper with text overlaid and references to specific pieces of music. So it's a multi-layered autobiographical, theatrical, operatic account of her life and her family's life, painted in watercolor. When she finished it, she gave the full stack of paintings to her doctor and said, "Keep this safe. It is my whole life." And she was deported to Auschwitz in September 1943, and she died in the concentration camp. She was 26 years old. And her doctor did keep the work. That's how we know about it. It can be seen at the Jewish Historical Museum in Amsterdam. It's a powerful work because of the urgency with which it was created in this family where so many people had died by suicide, and now she realized she was likely going to die by murder. And she felt like she had to get it out. It was urgent for her. So she didn't edit. Her process was not editing. Her process was not waiting. She just painted every day for 2 years while she waited to see what happened. She painted. The timeline of the work was compressed, and she managed to fully document her life in this specific, very, very unique way because of that. The other person I'm going to talk about in this section is Keith Haring. So he built his career in New York. He was born in 1958. He started with chalk drawings in the subway system on the black paper that was covering the unused advertising spaces. It was public, it was free. So he was creating there first as a street artist. And then he moved into gallery shows and large scale commissions. And by the mid 1980s, he was known internationally. And at that time, he was also diagnosed with HIV/AIDS. And he was 30 years old, and he was public about his diagnosis at a time when it was very, very stigmatized, and there was not a cure, and having it was considered a death sentence. In 1989, so just 1 year after he was diagnosed, he founded the Keith Haring Foundation with a mandate to support AIDS organizations and children's programs. He completed major mural commissions internationally. He opened the Pop Shop to generate foundation income to keep that foundation strong. He kept his studio practice running this whole time. He collaborated with the activist group ACT UP on the very famous poster that says ignorance equals fear, silence equals death. 1989 to 1990 was almost 2 years that he was just so prolific because there was urgency. He knew he was probably not going to live. The work from his final 2 years is really directly about mortality. It's about body. It's about loss, much more than his earlier work. So the content is informed by the mortality and what he was going through, but the lines are the same, the figures are the same. The urgency isn't in the content in that way. The urgency is in the I don't know, the scale, the prolificness. He knew that this was the present time and that's all he had, that he did not have a future. Which was true. He died in 1990 at the age of only 31. So temporal, he knew that was coming. Of course, there's other examples of people who live much, much later into life than these two who, it's in those last, in their 80s and their 90s that they thought, okay, this is the last work I'm going to do. What should it be? Health impacting creative process in that way. And then finally, the last thing I want to talk about is collaborative necessity. Again, the cultural story about making is that it happens alone in a room with a single person whose singular vision produces the work. We know that's not true. We know that most of the famous men who have done well as artists over history, many of them were able to do so because they were supported by the women in their lives, and sometimes vice versa. Even in this, we see that other people did help with the adaptations to the process caused by health. So Frida Kahlo, the easel, she did not put the easel there. I believe it was her mother installed the easel for her. So, and then Georgia O'Keeffe, remember, she switched to clay away from painting. But then when she switched back to painting, it was her assistant that helped her set up the canvases. So these adaptations sometimes require other people. So sometimes our health requires us to change our creative process to include other people in a new way in the process. Judith Scott, who was born in 1943 in Columbus, Ohio, with Down syndrome, was institutionalized at the age of 7. And sorry, I'm misstating that. She and her sister, Judith and Joyce, were born together, and Judith had Down syndrome. And I'm okay. Try this one more time. Judith was institutionalized, like I said, and Joyce was looking for her. So for 35 years, Joyce didn't know where her sister was because her sister, Judith, who had Down syndrome, was in the institution. But eventually, Joyce found her. She became her guardian. And in 1987, she enrolled Judith at Creative Growth Art Center here in the Bay Area. And they provide studio space and creative support to adults with various disabilities. So Judith she had Down syndrome, she was deaf, she was non-speaking, she had no formal language, she's not verbal in that way. In the first year or so that she was at Creative Growth, she didn't really make anything. She was there, but wasn't making. And then the fiber artist Sylvia 70 began offering weaving classes at Creative Growth, and Judith, that was her thing. She had never she didn't weave. So weaving wasn't her thing, but the fiber art became her thing. So she began wrapping. She wrapped various objects in yarn and thread, like small things and then large things. And then it became this whole thing and it grew into these like person-sized sculptures. And she did this for 18 years. So she passed away in 2005, but she created these huge, well-known or now well-known wrapped sculptures that are just a very unique part of the work. So in terms of collaborative necessity, her process required first that her sister came and got her and put her in the art class. So she wouldn't have put herself there. She didn't have that autonomy to do that. So there's that. But then also it was the meeting of the class, Sylvia's class, and the infrastructure, the collaborative infrastructure provided by Creative Growth. All of this, the staff, the setting, all of this helped facilitate the creative process for her. It is unlikely that the work would have ever existed if that all hadn't been in place, as evidenced by plenty of people who have been institutionalized and nothing was created because they didn't have the autonomy or ability or access to materials to do so. Judith Scott could not communicate in language, as I said, but the work she made is communication. It is dense, intentional, it's materially sophisticated, is uniquely hers. It comes from her interior world. It's a type of art that is her form of self-expression produced specifically by her body and her situation and her circumstance. And her circumstance did include that collaborative necessity with other people. She's the only one I'm gonna use in this category, but across all of these, there are so many examples. I'd love to hear what you guys can think of in terms of these 6 different areas, which artists you can think of, or even if you've had experiences yourself that you've adapted your creative process and the way you make things as the direct result of losing your senses or a sense or having different physical needs or being in a situation where you needed to collaborate with other people in order for your creativity to work or any of these things. I'd be super curious for anything you have to say about that. My creative process has grown out of probably temporal is the most the common thing for me. So I am not someone who can work 9 to 5 every day. I currently am mentally, emotionally, physically pretty well. So most days I can work a semi-regular schedule, but that hasn't always been true. And I also have what we talked about before with Virginia Woolf. So I have come to recognize that there are times when I cannot sustain working for long periods of time. Not only that, but I cannot work deeply I get brain fog from a variety of things, but mostly from periods of depression. And the brain fog means I can't think clearly, so then I can't write clearly, so then I can't do that kind of sustained work. I can't write a book in that condition. I remember there was a point in time after I had written Crochet Saved My Life and before I'd written anything else that I was going through pretty bad depression again. And I literally thought that maybe I had used up all my words. Like I literally thought, I don't think words are going to come to me again. And of course they did. And I've written many things since then, but I literally could not write in that way. However, it didn't mean I couldn't create. It meant that I could write letters or I could crochet or I could collage. So even still these days, if I don't have the energy, for example, to record a podcast, today I had really good energy. But if I didn't have that energy, I might have written emails or, started drafting an idea for something or looked at grant applications to see what I could apply for. I adjust to the amount of time I have, which is based directly on energy caused by the symptoms or lack thereof of what I'm going through. So that's my experience. I would love to hear yours. And then I don't have a ton left here in my notes, but we're at about an hour for this. So we're in episode 5 of the podcast, Creative Process. Just really quick, I want to talk about what these 13 artists share. There are so many artists I could have chosen for this, but these are the ones that I am working with, and I want to note that they're different in so many ways. So in terms of medium, we have percussion, painting, photography, guitar, sculpting, writing, filmmaking, or what film did I say? Film making? In any case, they were born across 6 different continents, across 4 different centuries, and their conditions include such a range of things that we've covered: deafness from birth, deafness starting at birth, deafness from illness, loss of vision, spinal injury, burned hands, polio, neurological hallucinations, schizophrenia or something similar, bipolar or something similar, Down syndrome, HIV/AIDS, and also the unique situation that of the war for a couple of them. So the urgency of the life circumstance rather than the health circumstance. They're all really different. And I don't want to name it as overcoming their circumstances. That's, they all had a variety of different, like in terms of what you would externally call success, lifetime. Virginia Woolf died by suicide. There was several of them were institutionalized. So it's not that they're overcoming their circumstances. It's not in spite of these circumstances, is that these are the circumstances that created the conditions under which they could create. And so what they all have in common, I believe, is that the condition was inside the process of their making. So it wasn't separate from it. The condition they had was inside the process. Starting with Glennie, we talked about how the deafness inside the deafness itself became the process of the methodology of creating music in a way that was related to feeling it in her body the way that she did. Inside of being bedridden was the process that Frida Kahlo used. Inside of the urgency of some of these is how people were prolific. So I say it's not about overcoming because this narrative puts the condition itself on one side and the work on the other. They worked in spite of, and that it creates this terrible idea that they had to have some kind of certain will or persistence to create, which might be true in some ways, but it just isn't the whole story. It's the condition exists. They aren't necessarily separate from each other. It's not that we have this condition and then separately we have the work and how do we make that happen? It's that the condition and the work are intricately tied together. So our health impacts our creative process in all kinds of different ways. Any maker who right now is listening to this and navigating a health condition of your own, you might want to think about the 6 mechanisms. Are you affected by your senses? Are you affected by time? Do you need to collaborate with someone in order to do your work? You might have a different mechanism that I haven't named here. One is unique, but looking at these categories and the way that other artists have adapted and dealt with these things can be a way to think about your own strengths and resilience and what works for you. There is nothing like bad or good about any of it. It's what do you want your creativity to be? And given what your health is, what does that look like for you? So going back to the Creative Health Cartography workbook that I have created, which is available through Amazon. There's an exercise in the creative process chapter called Mapping Your Process Honestly. That is one of the ones that you might want to look at if this is an area that interests you. So this is episode 5. We have one more episode in the creative process category. Next week, episode 6, I'm going to kind of wrap things up and tie it together and say whatever I think I didn't say about theory and ideas and what's left in this section of the workbook, some reflection. going to work with that. And then we'll move on to the next section, which is creative medium. But I wanted to really focus today on bringing to you what I believe creative process, the ways it impacts health at kind of this broader level. I'm happy to answer any questions. The best way to pose those is probably in the comments on Substack, createmefree.substack.com. Please subscribe. This podcast is available as an audio podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. It's also, I believe, on YouTube podcasts. But the main home where I'm recording it and sharing it is Substack. And if you subscribe there annually, then you receive all of the goodies, including all of the paid episodes. So I hope you will join me there. And I look forward to speaking to you next week.